The manor had stood for over a century, a colossal monument to wealth and secrecy. Its walls, once vibrant with the laughter of generations, now seemed heavy with shadows, each corner whispering tales long buried beneath varnished floors and polished marble. On the surface, the estate was immaculate, gleaming chandeliers reflected perfectly on the marble halls. Carpets muffled footsteps into silence, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and lavender. But beneath that veneer, it was a tomb of unspoken truths. The master, Jonathan Vero, ruled this household not merely as a father or husband, but as a silent tyrant whose gaze could freeze a man mid-step. He was the embodiment of order and intimidation. His smile rarely reached his eyes, and his kindness was measured, precise, almost surgical. Servants obeyed, children feared, and neighbors envied, but no one truly knew him. Not his wife, not his children, not the friends who visited for business or pleasure. There were whispers, always whispers, but Jonathan had the uncanny ability to extinguish them before they grew into flames. On a rainy Tuesday morning, the quiet of the manor was pierced by the arrival of a letter, small and innocuous, delivered by a courier whose gloves bore the faintest traces of mud from the estate's long driveways. It was unremarkable in appearance, just an envelope, but something about it carried the weight of impending calamity. The seal was old, waxed in deep crimson, stamped with a symbol that Jonathan had not seen in decades, the emblem of a past he had tried to erase. He opened it slowly, almost ceremoniously, his gloved fingers trembling imperceptibly. Inside was a photograph, nothing extraordinary at first glance, just a boy, perhaps 12, standing in an unremarkable garden, eyes too old for his face, staring directly at the camera. But it was the boy's resemblance to Jonathan that made the room grow colder. The sharp curve of the jaw, the high forehead, the exact slope of the nose, it was impossible to ignore. For a long moment he did nothing. The photograph lay on his desk, yet it seemed to stare at him, accusing, relentless. Outside, the wind rattled the windows like the whispers of the dead. "You're late, Jonathan," his wife Eleanor said from the doorway. She had been studying a ledger, her brows furrowed, unaware of the storm about to enter her life. He didn't answer. He could not. The photograph had brought something old, something he had buried so deeply that even he had convinced himself it no longer existed. The children, James and Lila, were oblivious upstairs, their laughter carrying faintly down the halls. They were the product of his careful planning, the perfect children of a perfect household. They had never questioned the order, the silence, the rigid structure of their lives. But soon that would change. The photograph, innocent as it appeared, carried within it the power to unravel everything Jonathan had built. The servants, moving quietly through the marble corridors, sensed something too. There was always a tension when Jonathan's mind turned inward, a heaviness that made even the most hardened housekeeper uneasy. Today, whispers seemed louder in the kitchens, shadows darker in the hallways. It was as if the manor itself had inhaled sharply and was holding its breath. Jonathan picked up the photograph again, turning it over in his hands. On the back was a date 2 decades ago, and a name he had not heard in years, Michael. That name, like a sharpened blade, cut through the careful armor he had built around himself. Michael, his son, the son he had hidden, the son who had grown in the world without his father's guidance, without his father's recognition. The memory came unbidden, unrelenting, a fleeting encounter, a mistake made in youth, a child taken away under the guise of protection, a life erased from all records. The consequences of that one decision had been swallowed by time, but now, like a shadow refusing to stay in the dark, it had returned. Eleanor noticed the photograph finally, and her voice trembled, though she tried to mask it. "Who is he?" Jonathan's eyes did not leave the photograph. No one, someone from the past. The lie felt thin, like paper stretched over a wound, but Eleanor was sharp. She studied his face, noticing the tightening of his jaw, the slight twitch of his fingers, the way his gaze lingered too long on the boy's eyes. "Jonathan, tell me." He could not. Words failed him. Confession was impossible. Not yet. The secret had been kept for 20 years. It had protected him, shaped him, defined him. To speak now would be to shatter the delicate order of his world. And yet, As he sat there in the dim light of the study, shadows stretching across the floor like dark fingers, Jonathan felt the first tremor of inevitability. The photograph was more than paper and ink, it was a harbinger. It was the first step in a chain of events that would tear apart the manor, the family, and the carefully constructed life he had spent decades maintaining. The rain outside turned into a storm, thrashing against the windows with renewed fury. Thunder growled in the distance, a sound almost human in its menace. The house shivered as if acknowledging the truth it had always known. Secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of clawing back into the light. Later that evening, Jonathan retreated to the library, a cavernous room filled with books that smelled of dust and leather. He sat in the leather chair, the photograph resting on the desk before him, and allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. He thought of Michael, his son, a boy who had grown up without a father, a boy whose existence he had denied. Guilt gnawed at him, sharp and persistent, but so did fear. Fear of the consequences, fear of the family's reaction, fear of the empire he had built crumbling like brittle stone. Somewhere deep within him, a voice whispered that this was only the beginning. That photograph was not a coincidence. It was a message, a warning, a call to reckon with the past. And Jonathan knew with a certainty that chilled him that once the truth emerged, nothing would ever be the same. He stared at the boy's eyes until the room grew dark around him, and in that darkness, the first cracks of a perfect life began to show. Thin lines at first, but soon wide enough for the light of revelation to pour through. The manor, silent and imposing, seemed to lean closer, as if eager to witness the unraveling. Shadows gathered in the corners, whispering secrets that had waited decades to be spoken. Somewhere upstairs the children laughed, unaware of the storm approaching, and somewhere beyond the walls a boy named Michael continued his life, ignorant of the fact that his world was about to collide violently with the one he had never known. The photograph lay on the desk, still and calm. Yet it carried within it the weight of an entire life, a life that Jonathan had tried desperately to hide. And in that quiet, brooding study, with rain battering the windows and the storm raging outside, the first page of an unstoppable story was written, not in ink, but in shadows, in silence, and in the cold truth that one photograph could indeed change everything. The manor never fully recovered from that first tremor. In the days that followed, the photograph remained on Jonathan's desk, a silent predator waiting, each glance a dagger pressing deeper into his chest. Sleep became a fragile illusion. The candlelight flickered across the study walls like accusing eyes. Every creak of floorboards, every distant murmur of servants, felt like an interrogation. Jonathan had always ruled through control, through fear, but now the illusion of mastery was cracking under the weight of a single image. Eleanor, sharp and perceptive, could sense the subtle shifts in the household. Jonathan's usual composure had frayed. His steps no longer echoed with confident authority. They were careful, calculated, almost furtive. He avoided the family at dinner, his voice clipped, his smiles forced. The children noticed the tension too. James, inquisitive and bold, asked questions about a distant relative, a boy he had never seen, his tone curious but tinged with suspicion. Leela, quieter and more observant, simply watched her father, noting the shadows under his eyes, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly as he poured wine. One evening, a stranger arrived, not the courier, not a visitor with pleasantries, but a man whose presence seemed to absorb light. He introduced himself as Nathaniel Hart, a private investigator, or so he claimed, but his eyes were keen, probing, as if he had already seen the photograph before it had even reached the manor. "I believe we have a mutual interest in a matter long buried," Nathaniel said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. He did not wait for an invitation. He carried a leather folder, worn, with papers sticking out in disordered layers. Jonathan's pulse quickened. This was no coincidence. How did you? Jonathan's words faltered. He had spent decades ensuring no one could trace Michael, no one could connect the boy to him. And yet here was a man, confident, unyielding, bringing the past storming into the present. Nathaniel ignored the question. He laid the folder on the desk. "I have information about Michael there. I believe he is your son." The words fell like stones in a silent cathedral. Jonathan's mind raced, a torrent of fear, regret, and anger. How could this have happened? Who had betrayed the sanctity of his secret? Eleanor stepped closer, her expression a mixture of dread and determination. "Michael, your son?" Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried through the tensioned, thickened air like a warning bell. "Yes," Nathaniel replied. "He exists. He has a life beyond this house, and he is coming." Jonathan felt the walls close in. Every servant, every hidden corner of the manor, every shadow that had once served him now seemed complicit in exposing him. He could almost hear the whisper of the photograph, mocking, relentless. "You thought you buried him. You were wrong." The folder contained everything: birth records, old letters, court documents, photographs of Michael growing up, letters he had written to the master that had never been sent, a life meticulously documented yet invisible until now. Each page was a revelation, each word a fresh wound. Jonathan's hands shook as he flipped through them, unable to stop despite the sharp ache it brought to his chest. The letters spoke of longing, of confusion, of a boy who had always known he was missing something fundamental in his life. Each one echoed with the quiet pain of absence, a mirror to the void Jonathan had allowed to exist. And then there was the proof, the undeniable evidence that Michael was indeed his son. DNA results, signed affidavits from people who had known the truth, witnesses who had kept the secret for decades. Eleanor read over his shoulder, her face pale. "All these years he's been alive and you never—" Her voice trailed off, choked with disbelief. Jonathan could not answer. No words could bridge the gap between his silence and the devastating truth. He had believed secrecy was protection. Now, secrecy was a weapon turned against him. Outside, the storm had not abated. Rain fell in thick sheets, washing the world in grey, obscuring boundaries and blurring lines. Inside, the manor felt smaller, its vast halls oppressive, suffocating. Jonathan's empire of control was eroding, and the first cracks in his carefully constructed life were widening into chasms. Meanwhile, beyond the gates of the manor, Michael lived unaware. Yet destiny was already drawing him toward the house he had never known. He moved through his own life with confidence, yet always carrying a quiet sense of being incomplete, a gnawing emptiness he could never explain. Now, letters from strangers, inquiries from private eyes, and rumors he had dismissed as coincidence began to converge, guiding him toward the truth. The servants, too, began to sense the shift. Whispered conversations ceased abruptly when Jonathan entered a room. Their loyalty wavered between fear and curiosity. Eyes that once avoided his gaze now searched it for signs of weakness. Shadows once obedient now seemed restless, clinging to corners, watching, listening. Jonathan paced the library, the photograph in one hand, Nathaniel's folder in the other. Every scenario played out in his mind. Confrontation, accusation, humiliation, betrayal. He had been prepared for business rivals, for scandals, for financial ruin, but nothing could have prepared him for the reckoning of his own blood. The revelation was complete. The photograph had been a spark, the evidence a roaring blaze, and as Jonathan stared into the dim corners of the library, he understood the truth he had long avoided. This was not merely a secret anymore. This was an exposure, a collision of past and present that would destroy illusions, rupture the family, and challenge the very foundations of the manor he had ruled with such precision. For the first time in decades, Jonathan Vare felt powerless, and somewhere miles away, a boy named Michael felt a pull, subtle and inexorable, drawing him toward a home and a father he had never known. Michael had never known luxury. His life had been a study in shadowed streets, cramped apartments, and fleeting opportunities. The world outside the manor had shaped him differently, harder, sharper, but also resilient. He moved through life like a predator among prey, instinctively wary, carrying an invisible weight that no one could see, but he could always feel. There were moments, brief and bitter, when he glimpsed the disparity between himself and others, the ease with which some walked through life as if it had been handed to them. He learned early that nothing was given freely, that every inch of survival had to be earned. Yet, despite the hardness imposed by circumstance, Michael had an uncanny grace, a quiet intelligence, a moral compass honed in the darkness, and a sense of empathy that defied his rough upbringing. It was this combination that made him unknowingly reflect pieces of his father, the same sharp jaw, the same intense gaze, the same restless mind always seeking control over chaos. On the morning he first learned of Jonathan Vare, Michael was in a small apartment cluttered with books and papers. He had been working on a series of freelance investigations, piecing together stories that often went unnoticed, unappreciated, much like himself. Then came the letters, carefully delivered, cryptic, insisting on a meeting, warning of truths long hidden. The first envelope bore no return address, only the photograph of a boy that looked alarmingly like him. Michael stared at the image as if it were a mirror reflecting a life he had never lived. The resemblance was uncanny, the eyes, the shape of the face, the curve of the mouth. A shiver ran down his spine, the hairs on the back of his neck standing as if some unseen force was drawing him towards something inevitable. He didn't know the name Jonathan Vare yet, only that a series of coincidences, whispers, and hints had converged to a single horrifying possibility. The boy in the photograph was him. He, Michael, had been a ghost in another life, unacknowledged, unseen, yet unmistakably present in the shadows of a world that had never claimed him. The psychological weight of this realization was suffocating. He felt a surge of anger, confusion, and disbelief, tempered by the instinctive urge to survive. For years he had believed in self-reliance. Now he faced the knowledge that a father, had consciously chosen to erase him from existence. The thought of confrontation burned like acid in his gut, but he was careful to temper it with strategy, knowing that fury without calculation could destroy him. Michael's life up to this point had been defined by struggle. Nights spent working multiple jobs, days of solitary reflection, and the ever-present question of identity. He had built walls around himself, impermeable and dark, walls that had kept both fear and desire at bay. But now the walls felt porous, cracks forming as the unseen hand of fate pressed relentlessly against them. The knowledge of his father's existence, a man who held power, wealth, and influence, was both a temptation and a curse. As he traced the letters and documents provided by Nathaniel Hart, Michael began to piece together the fragments of a life that should have been his. Birth records, old letters, court testimonies all painted a portrait of a man who had deliberately concealed his existence. Each discovery was a knife in his chest, each fact a layer of betrayal that cut deeper than any hardship he had endured on the streets. Yet within the darkness, a spark of determination grew. Michael realized that this was more than personal history. It was a reckoning. He would confront the truth, demand answers, and claim what was his by blood and right, or at least expose the deception for all to see. The thought of the manor, the vast estate that had housed his father's life while he lived in shadows, consumed his imagination. He pictured the cold halls, the polished floors, the air filled with the ghosts of secrets. He imagined his father's face when confronted by the reality of a son grown strong despite abandonment. Michael's preparation was meticulous. He mapped the manor's grounds, learned its routines, studied Jonathan's public and private behaviors through discreet inquiries. Every servant, every shadowed corner, every hidden passage became part of the strategy. He was careful, patient, relentless qualities honed by a life of necessity. But beneath the calculated exterior, the emotional storm raged. Rage and longing, resentment and curiosity, fear and anticipation all intermingle. Michael knew that stepping into the manor would not be simply a confrontation with a man. It would be a collision with an entire world that had excluded him. He was entering a palace of secrets, where every smile might conceal scorn, every gesture could be a trap, and every shadow held a memory of his absence. In the nights leading to his arrival, Michael often sat alone, staring at the photograph. The boy's eyes seemed to pierce through him, haunting, accusing, echoing the unanswered questions that had haunted his entire life. Why was I hidden? Why was I denied? The photograph was a portal, a threshold between his life in darkness and the world of wealth and power that should have been his. And as the storm raged outside his apartment, echoes of thunder rolling across the city like distant war drums, Michael made a choice. He would not approach the manor as a boy seeking acknowledgement. He would approach it as a storm itself, as a force that would tear through the silken walls of secrecy Jonathan had built. He would demand truth. He would demand recognition. He would stand in the halls of the manor and declare his existence. The city outside seemed indifferent, unaware that a reckoning was underway. But Michael's world had changed. The hidden son, the boy erased from history, was no longer invisible. He was approaching the life that had always belonged to him, yet had been denied. And in the shadows of both his apartment and the manor, a confrontation loomed, a collision that would expose every lie, every omission, and every secret the master had carried for decades. The manor remained unaware of the storm that approached, but the wind carried it, the rain heralded it, and the shadows whispered of it. In the coming days, the corridors of power and privilege would tremble, the fragile balance of family and authority would shatter, and the calm of Jonathan's world would be irreparably lost. Michael's steps were measured, deliberate, each one echoing toward a future fraught with peril, revelation, and darkness. The hidden sun was no longer hidden. The manor had never felt colder. Even on the brightest day, the marble halls seemed to swallow light, reflecting only the shadows of hidden fears. But today the air carried a weight beyond weather or architecture. It trembled with the presence of inevitability. Every servant felt it. Every shadow seemed to quiver, and even the walls themselves seemed to lean in, as though anticipating the storm about to descend. Michael arrived just as twilight began to bleed into the sky, casting the corridors in shades of grey and black. He walked with purpose, each step deliberate, carrying not only himself, but the weight of every unanswered question, every stolen year, and every injustice he had suffered. He was no boy, no child of whispers and photographs. He was a force grown sharp and unyielding, a living reckoning of the secrets Jonathan had buried so deeply. The front doors of the manor, once symbols of welcoming opulence, now loomed like the gates of judgment. Michael entered silently, blending into the dim light, and for a brief moment it felt as if the house itself had recognized him. The grand chandelier above flickered slightly, casting fractured reflections that seemed to echo the fractured lives within these walls. Jonathan waited in the study, dreading that this moment would come. The photograph had been only the beginning. Nathaniel's investigations had made the collision unavoidable. Every nerve in Jonathan's body screamed for retreat, yet he could not. He was the master of this house, or at least he had believed he was. And now a son he had denied, a life he had erased, stood at the edge of his world, ready to rip it apart. Michael, Jonathan's voice was calm, but the calm held a dangerous edge, brittle and sharp. You shouldn't be here. Michael stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Jonathan, mirroring the same intensity, the same controlled fury. I think it's time I was, he said, his voice low, measured, yet carrying the weight of decades denied. You kept me hidden. You denied me a life, but I'm here now, and I need answers. Eleanor appeared behind Jonathan, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Fear, anger, and disbelief warred within her. Jonathan, she whispered, but the name sounded hollow, a thread barely holding the walls together. The children, James and Lila, had been drawn into the room silently, sensing the tension. They did not understand the full measure of what had arrived, only that the world they knew was shifting beneath their feet. Jonathan's hands clenched behind his back. Answers, he repeated. Do you truly think I can provide them after all this time? Michael's gaze did not waver. I don't want excuses. I want truth. I want to know why you erased me, why you hid me, while living a life of comfort and privilege. A tremor ran through Jonathan's frame, though he forced his posture into an illusion of strength. He had rehearsed this confrontation countless times in the solitude of the library, but now the reality was far sharper, far more painful. Words stumbled, faltered, died on his tongue. You were dangerous, Jonathan finally said, his voice low, uneven. Your mother's death, it was impossible to. He broke off, swallowed by his own hesitation. His carefully constructed narrative of protection, secrecy, and control had failed him. The past, he realized, was no longer his to govern. Michael took a step closer, the shadows of the room swallowing him like a cloak. Dangerous? I was a child. And you? You chose your comfort over me. Every letter ignored, every attempt I might have made to reach you denied. Do you understand what that feels like? Eleanor gasped, stepping forward. Jonathan, how could you? Her voice cracked under the weight of betrayal. All these years, our children, and this secret. James, usually defiant and self-assured, looked at his father with suspicion for the first time. Lila clutched her mother's hand, her eyes wide, reflecting both fear and confusion. The perfect family facade, so carefully maintained, was splintering before their eyes. Jonathan's chest tightened. He had lived in the illusion that secrets were protection, that control was survival. Now he faced the ruin that control had wrought. Michael was no longer a boy to manipulate or fear. He was a man forged in adversity, unflinching, unrelenting, and demanding truth. The confrontation escalated, words sharp as blades, slicing through years of silence. Michael spoke of betrayal, of absence, of the hollow ache of a life lived without a father. Jonathan tried to respond with explanations, but each excuse sounded hollow, each justification fragile. Eleanor's anger grew, her disappointment cutting deeper than Michael's accusations, piercing Jonathan's carefully maintained armor. Servants watched silently from doorways, their loyalty fractured between fear of the master and the raw, undeniable justice of Michael's presence. Shadows in the corners seemed to shift with the tension, as if the house itself were aware that its master's reign was imperiled. Michael's presence forced Jonathan into a confession he had denied himself for decades. He spoke of youthful mistakes, of love lost and choices made in fear. He admitted to the decision that had erased Michael from the world, to the sacrifices he believed necessary at the time. Yet every word, every justification, fell flat against the magnitude of loss experienced by the son he had abandoned. Anger and sorrow collided in a crescendo. James and Leela, caught in the crossfire, felt the fragile threads of family loyalty strain. Eleanor, torn between love and revulsion, struggled to contain the chaos, and Michael, standing in the center of the room, became a living embodiment of the consequences of secrecy, the tangible reminder that truth, once unearthed, could not be buried again. The confrontation ended not with resolution, but with rupture. The manor, once a place of order, had transformed into a theater of exposed secrets and unspoken guilt. Every glance, every gesture carried new meaning. Jonathan's authority was fractured, Eleanor's trust broken, and the children's innocence forever altered. Michael's presence was not just a revelation. It was a force that demanded acknowledgement, reshaping the lives of all who had believed themselves untouchable by the past. As night fell, and the storm outside raged with renewed fury, the family remained in fractured silence, each member grappling with the aftermath of confrontation. The manor, silent and brooding, seemed to breathe with them, walls heavy with the weight of truth, shadows deep with the memory of betrayal, and corridors echoing with the consequences of a secret long denied. And somewhere in the stillness Michael's gaze swept over the rooms he had never known, understanding with chilling clarity that the confrontation had only begun, and that the darkness within the manor, and within the master himself, had yet to be fully faced. The manor no longer felt like a home. Its corridors, once symbols of authority and elegance, had transformed into a labyrinth of suspicion, guilt, and unspoken truths. Shadows clung to the walls with a weight heavier than ever, as if absorbing the echoes of the confrontation. Even the furniture seemed altered. Chairs, once polished, now reflected only fractured images of the family. Mirrors became instruments of reflection, not of appearances, but of sins long hidden. Jonathan sat alone in the study, the photograph of Michael on the desk before him. He traced the edges of the paper as though doing so could erase decades of mistakes. The storm outside had subsided, leaving the world drenched in grey, washed of colour and cheer, much like his spirit. His empire of control had collapsed, not through external attack, but through the undeniable force of truth. The son he had hidden, erased, and denied, now stood in his life with a presence that could not be ignored. Eleanor moved quietly through the manor, her face still pale, her hands trembling slightly. The confrontation had revealed more than Jonathan's betrayal. It had revealed the fragility of their carefully maintained family facade. She had loved him for decades, yet she now saw the man beneath the mask, flawed, fearful, and capable of cruelty under the guise of protection. Her trust was shattered, and rebuilding it seemed a task as impossible as reconciling sunlight with darkness. Michael, meanwhile, walked through the halls with deliberate calm. The manor was no longer merely the home of his father. It was a stage on which the truths of his life had been performed. Every step he took was measured, heavy with meaning. He examined the rooms where he had never lived, noting the luxury that had been denied to him, and the shadows that had always seemed to exist in tandem with wealth and power. The realization that he had been both erased and inevitably present in this world, a ghost in the life he was now entering, filled him with a strange mixture of anger and inevitability. The confrontation had left wounds that would not heal quickly. James, the eldest, wrestled with resentment. He had grown up believing himself the sole heir to his father's life, and now that belief was shattered. His confidence, once steady and assured, wavered as he realized his father had a past he had been denied. Leela, sensitive and intuitive, felt the shifting currents of fear, confusion, and curiosity. The family she had known, the safe world of structured routines, had dissolved into uncertainty. Yet even amidst the tension, subtle movements toward reconciliation began to emerge. Michael did not seek to destroy the manor or its inhabitants. His goal was acknowledgement, truth, and, perhaps, a place within the world that had once denied him. He approached Jonathan one evening in the dim library, where shadows pooled in corners like silent witnesses. "I don't want your wealth," Michael said, his voice low, unwavering. "I want the truth. I want to understand why my life was erased. And I want to be recognized, not as a threat, not as a claim, but as your son." Jonathan's hands shook slightly. He had expected fury, demands, perhaps even hatred, but this calm assertion cut deeper than any accusation could have. He realized that his son's resilience, his strength forged in adversity, reflected a part of himself he had long denied or disowned. Jonathan began, faltering. "I believed I was protecting you. I thought secrecy would keep you safe. I was wrong. All these years I thought control was the same as care. I see now it was betrayal." Eleanor, listening nearby, exhaled slowly. She understood that the path to reconciliation would be slow, painful, and incomplete. Forgiveness would not be granted easily, nor would trust return quickly. Yet acknowledgement, the first step toward truth, had been made. The servants, too, sensed a subtle shift in the household. The fear that had once held them in rigid obedience began to relax slightly, replaced by the cautious curiosity of people witnessing the unraveling of secrets. They moved through corridors with measured steps, aware that the manor, for all its grandeur, had become a place of reckoning, not merely a home. Over the following weeks, tentative routines re-emerged, not of perfection, but of fragile balance. Michael explored the manor with growing awareness of its history and his own place within it. He discovered hidden letters, secret rooms, and the echoes of his father's past mistakes. Jonathan, once consumed by pride and control, now spent hours reflecting on the consequences of secrecy, recognizing the depth of the damage he had wrought. Eleanor worked to mediate between father and son, between past and present, understanding that reconciliation was an ongoing struggle rather than an immediate resolution. James and Leela began to adjust, each in their own way. James, initially defiant, began to see Michael not as a threat, but as a mirror, reflecting both the potential for destruction and the capacity for growth. Leela, sensitive to emotional currents, found herself both curious and cautious, learning to navigate the new family dynamic with awareness and resilience. The manor itself seemed to transform along with its inhabitants. The shadows that had once whispered secrets of deceit now reflected the possibilities of healing. The corridors, still echoing with past mistakes, became pathways toward understanding. Even the storm, which had seemed a permanent companion, subsided into gentle rains that nourished rather than destroyed. Yet the story of the manor, the master, and the hidden son was not one of perfect resolution. Dark truths remained. Past mistakes could not be fully erased, and the consequences of decades-long secrecy lingered in the hearts of all who had lived through it. The photograph, once a simple image, had revealed more than a hidden son it had unveiled. The fragility of human morality, the dangers of secrecy, and the inevitability of truth. In the quiet of the library, Jonathan placed the photograph in a frame, not as a relic of guilt, but as a reminder of the reckoning that had reshaped his life. Michael, standing nearby, watched him with measured patience, recognizing both the flaws and the humanity of the man who had once been absent from his life. And in that space where shadows and light intertwined, a family fractured, imperfect, and forever changed began, the slow, uncertain process of transformation. The manor remained as it always had, a monument to wealth and secrecy, but now it also bore witness to truth, reconciliation, and the unyielding presence of a son who had returned from the shadows to claim his existence. The darkness did not disappear, but it no longer suffocated. It became a reminder, a teacher, a constant companion in the understanding that every hidden truth carries consequences, and that the reckoning, once begun, can reshape even the grandest of lives. The photograph had done more than reveal a hidden son. It had shattered the illusion of control that Jonathan Vare had maintained for decades. What began as a simple image, innocent, silent, almost forgotten, had grown into a force capable of unraveling lives, exposing lies, and forcing truths long denied into the light. The manor, once a fortress of order and authority, had become a theater of consequences, each shadow a witness to betrayal and revelation. Jonathan, stripped of the power of secrecy, faced himself as he had never before. He had believed control was protection, silence was care, and erasure was mercy. Yet in the wake of Michael's arrival, he realized that every choice made to protect had, in fact, imprisoned not only his son, but himself. Guilt, regret, and the bitter awareness of his own fallibility became his constant companions. The master had learned too late, perhaps, that authority without honesty is fragile, and that the walls we build to hide the past are never truly unassailable. Michael, the hidden son, embodied both reckoning and resilience. His life outside the manor, forged in struggle, had prepared him to face the truths Jonathan had long denied. He demanded acknowledgement, not out of vengeance, but from the unyielding need to exist as himself, complete, recognized, and unhidden. His presence reshaped the family, forcing them to confront not only his existence, but the shadows within their own hearts. He was a reminder that truth, once unearthed, cannot be ignored. Eleanor, James, and Lila, each in their own way, were forced to reckon with the imperfection of their lives. Eleanor's love and trust were tempered by the bitter knowledge of deception. James learned that privilege is fragile when built on secrets. Lila discovered the fragility of innocence and the strength needed to navigate a fractured family. Together they faced the unsettling reality that the world they knew had irrevocably changed, and that healing would be a slow, deliberate process. The manor, silent and imposing, now bore witness not only to wealth and power, but to truth and consequence. Its walls had absorbed decades of secrets, and yet they survived to reflect a new order, one shaped not by control, but by reckoning. Shadows remained, for darkness does not vanish with acknowledgement alone, but it no longer suffocated. It became a reminder of human imperfection, the danger of silence, and the inevitability of exposure. In the end, the photograph, a small, unassuming piece of paper, had changed everything. It had revealed a hidden life, forced a confrontation with past sins, and demanded transformation from all who dwelled within the manor. Lives had been fractured, identities reshaped, and truths finally spoken. The story of the master and his hidden son became a testament to the power of revelation, the cost of secrecy, and the enduring force of reckoning. And as the shadows lingered in the corners of the grand halls, they carried a quiet lesson. The past can never be fully erased. The truth will always surface, and those who hide from it are ultimately consumed by the darkness they create.